in the middle of a Thanksgiving series. Each Thanksgiving it gives me an opportunity, which I did last week, to tell Squanto's story. I saw a few ball games, and it just was, as far as I knew, if I knew nothing about Thanksgiving and America, what I would have been convinced it has something to do with turkeys, because it was Turkey Day, turkey meal, turkey this. And so, total stranger, that's what I would have surmised. Thanksgiving has to do with turkeys. And that is not what it has to deal with. I've had a very delightful week as I've sat near Faye and tended to all the kinds of things that needed to be tended to. I have been reading extensively in the revised edition of The Light and the Glory, and I have come back after the week. I told Faye, I am so humbled that I knew so little of our real history. And I wasn't the least bit interested in history when I was going through school. It was one of the classes, we're going to have history and facts and so on. Now I'm in my 70s and I think so differently about history. Think about, as I mentioned last week, family and events and how did we get here and this property and our country. And the Light and the Glory, as I said, was written from the perspective they became convinced God had a purpose for this nation, an overarching purpose. And that purpose was revealed in his movements in the earliest days of the establishment of our nation. I thought wrongly that his earliest days really were when the Pilgrims came in 1620. There were so many things that took place before 1620, and I'm revealing, if you were a history major, now you're very disappointed that I really thought, I shouldn't even say this, that was the first settlement colony movement of people in the United States in 1620 was the Pilgrims who came over. What about Jamestown? Oh yeah, there was a place called Jamestown in Virginia. I guess I was aware of that. And I was so short of understanding the movement of God in establishing this nation. And I think at this season, when you're not getting it over the media that blankets our land, whether you're talking about radio or TV or internet, I'm sure if you went to pastors and ministers, you would hear about what Thanksgiving really relates to and how it started. But I, again, highly recommend to you The Light and the Glory. So the intention is to really speak on this verse and to go after the story. Jesus said, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain." Yes, that was said in the context of the approaching cross that he was fully aware of. And yes, in the context of around the world these days, martyrdom seems to be on the rise. At least it seems to be. In our country, I believe we are having a dimension of a brief reprieve of what seems to be a tendency, a trend among a number in our country that religion is the problem, one of the major problems of people. We could face yet way more difficult days than we are facing at the moment. At the same time, the world seems to be moving in the direction, at least I'm among those who believe, that revival is coming, and a long ago prophesied billion-soul harvest that is going to be somewhat the end of this age. I believe we're just either it's beginning right now, or we're a year or two or three away from it going into full bloom. The billion-soul end-time harvest. But looking at America and Thanksgiving, the intent of this is to extend and deepen the Thanksgiving that you may walk in for God when he planned you, when he planned me, that it was this country and this time in history that he picked for you to be born. Maybe all the circumstances of your birth and family are not as you would have hoped for. Probably all of us have had elements that have been different than we would have anticipated or liked. At the same time, I would ask for the same parents, the same mother, the same father, the same 5 brothers and sisters, the same location. I was born in Miami. I would have picked the same because mine was a journey. I never saw fights in my home. I never saw yelling. I never saw drink, alcohol. I never saw my father say one thing, never one sharp cross word to my mother in all the years that I lived, about 21 when I married and moved out. So I know I came from a home that's a very unusual home. I'd live in the same home. I'd have the same parents. You may not be able to say that. You may be able to say that. Yours may be just a devastating tragedy, and here you are. You have seen the grace of God help you. Last week I began with this. For me, I believe the foundation pillar in Scripture could be John 3:16. Could be Ephesians 2:8 and 9, for by grace are you saved. Could be a number one. For me, it's Romans 1:21. Because it explains how to live life. It explains what's wrong with life. What's really wrong? What's the problem? If you can just boil the problem down, what is it? Can you identify being a bit of an academic, analytical type? I like to boil it down to points, 1 and 2 and 3 and so on. You may be far more intuitive, and that may almost be oppressive to you. I am sorry. Faye is more intuitive. I'm more analytical. But God chose for us to be together. It was his destiny. Romans 1:21, because though they knew God, they did not glorify. Problem number 1, it lists the 2 problems. It also is the 2 things that makes life work. They didn't glorify God as God, the Creator. Prior to this, it speaks about the creation, that the invisible things of God are clearly revealed in his creation. They didn't glorify, and it's known of all mankind, all through the earth, the stars, the skies, the complexity, life. It's foreign for the mind, the human mind, to look at everything and just say, this just happened. It just happened. They didn't glorify God as God, neither were they thankful. That there is a creator who has intentionality. He created us. He is good. He is altogether lovely. It got all mixed up. It went all crazy. And so God, the eternal Son, back before it even came into being, God in his foreknowledge knew what was going to happen. God, the eternal Son, through the counsel, the advice, the plan of the Father, whatever really happened, submit himself to the Father's will and said, I will do it. I will come. I will rescue humanity. I will destroy, loosen, so to speak, 1 Peter 3:8. I will loosen, destroy the works of the devil, that the works of God may be revealed in them. Jesus came to free us, loosen us from the grip, the grip of the devil's works, sin, and all of its impact. Jesus came to loosen that grip so that in him we can become free. These are the 2 things we can do. We can live a life where we glorify God as God. And we live a life where, as we grow, as we mature, we understand that thankfulness can be such a part of our life in every dimension. And there's so many things that the New Testament addresses. But I wanted to finish the story, at least the dimension. America, our story. What were they thankful for? What were the Pilgrims thankful for? I certainly told some of that story last time. Who also should we be thankful for, that we should thank God for? This was new to me. I was stunned as I read this week. I knew so little of history. I thought Christopher Columbus was a really good guy through and through. He wasn't. Again, the book that I have read and am reading is The Light and the Glory. The purpose of the book was a search for the hand of God in key periods of our nation's beginnings. Yes, I understand if you start with a premise, I'm looking to see this, you tend to find what you're looking for. But I have found it's amazing to see what they found. That was their premise. They believed God specifically had a purpose for this nation. And there are indications of that purpose in his clear movements of how we were founded. So you could start before the foundation of time. This is going to go so quick. Christopher Columbus, 1401 to 1606. You know, 1492. He was convinced, he was trying to go to India. And he was convinced that because the world, in his view, was round, that you could sail all the way across the ocean and you would come into the backside of India rather than the ways that they were approaching India in that season, that time, that place. And his great contribution was that he was an excellent navigator. And he had understood the winds and the currents in his years and years and years. And his intentions were good. He wanted to go and find lands where there were heathen, that the gospel of Jesus Christ could be presented to them. He was convinced by his journals and logs that he had been chosen by God for this task. It was a very specific task given to him, to open up these waterways. He was convinced of that. But he made a very tragic mistake when finally the day came that there was a king and queen of Spain who were willing to fund his voyages. And when that was the third, at least the third nation that he had sought support, a massive financial support. And when he was told, we will fund you, we will, then he made instantly 3 demands. It was shocking. The records show he made 3 instant demands. Number 1, he would want 10% of all the monies, gold that was found. Number 2, he wanted to be named admiral of the high seas. And number 3, every colony land, every land mass that he discovered, he wanted to be named the governor of those land masses. Now, his original stated intentions were to present the gospel, bring the gospel to people in lands, foreign lands, who hadn't heard the gospel. He landed, we guess, in the Bahamas. In his first voyage, he made 4 voyages. He landed in the Bahamas, Cuba, Haiti, eventually Central America and South America. He had 4 voyages. Originally, when he landed in the Bahamas, he was, according to his journals, met by very peaceful people, naked Indians who showered them with abundance of fruit. They had a little bit of gold. They were so kind to him, what the records were. He felt like it was such a benevolent people. He left a group of men because there were ships that were lost before they returned to Spain, and they left a palisade, they left a fort that had some 30 men in it, and went back to Spain. He was welcomed as a conquering hero with an abundance of accolades. And I've long heard that there are 3 huge enemies of those who are experiencing and tasting great success in life, and those are gold and glory and girls. The gold, the trap, and the entrapment of the gold, the glory, and the girls. It appeared in Christopher Columbus' life that the gold and the glory were absolutely paramount. It appeared in so many of the explorers, the girls and the gold and the glory, where the glory was the third. The girls and the gold seemed to just be so fan into things. So during those 4 expeditions, and once he came back with such successful information, there were so many expeditions that went out from Spain and went out from England and went out from France and went out from Portugal as this new world was discovered, not America yet, but as this new world was discovered, especially South America, Central America, and all the gold was found. The way the Indians were treated, now that was a difficult area to put all the pieces together. I'm not trying to put the pieces together. There were so many people, men, explorers that went, and found great quantities of gold, and their general plan was they found out who was the king in authority, the reigning Indian, and they would capture him and then charge ransom for him. And annihilation, when Columbus landed, we think in the Bahamas, there were some 320,000 Indians, natives in that region. Not many years afterwards, it was estimated there were 20,000 left. There was just genocide. It was awful. Whether God had intentions for Columbus to discover America or not, I know. The journals say when he started heading in the direction that he would have hit the United States, fierce winds and fierce storms were encountered, and he came to the conclusion God didn't want him to go in that direction. And he went to Central America and South America in later journeys. The problem was the gold and the glory. As soon as Christopher Columbus left, that fort that had some 30-some men, they each went after as many wives as they could get, and they made the Indians their servants. It was awful, and it was the beginning of a pattern of what took place all over in Central America, in South America. It was awful. Was that God's intention? It was interesting. Cortez would, in the 1500s, it was America, the founding of America. This is an element I just totally missed. Because it was the stated intention of almost every single one of those expeditions to bring Christ, they began to include monks, religious monks, among those who would be in those groups. And a number of those monks were ardent followers of Jesus Christ. And they had a true heart for the missionary expansion of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Cortez, in the 1500s, one of the Spanish conquerors, he wrote this, which this was written, but they did something. We seek not only to subdue boundless territory in the name of our emperor, Don Carlos, but to win millions of they were savage souls to the true faith. They wanted to win millions to Christ. Their actions didn't prove that, but the monks did. It was fascinating reading. There were their names, they were unfamiliar to me. Their stories are magnificent. There were three groups of friars or monks. There were Franciscans, there were the Dominicans, and there was the Jesuit, the Zealots. The Franciscan friars, they believed in simplicity. They believed in that passage that I started with, that in order for the kingdom to accomplish what God intends for it, the seed has to be planted in the ground and it has to die. It's possible that it means it has to die unto its own self, unto its own agenda, unto its own intentions. And in martyrdom, Jesus being the example of examples, he was referring to himself when he was talking about that. But I believe he was also referring to, you got to take up your cross daily and follow me. You have to die to yourself. He did. He came having died to himself. He lived a life of having died to himself. The only reason he was here was to accomplish the will of the Father. It became very clear of the hundreds and hundreds of expeditions that what was at the base of their heart was gold and glory and girls. Not living a life where they existed for one purpose, and that was for the will and glory of Jesus Christ and to accomplish God's purposes. It was clear that's not what went on. But in the founding of the United States, it appears that there was like a slow, small wave of monks over a century and a half that came to the United States, many of them living a sacrificial life of aloneness, giving themselves to the Indians to rescue them, to establish missions, to establish orphanages, and in some instances to establish training centers. And the record is astounding of what these mostly men who were zealots for Jesus Christ, and when they left Europe, they were almost assured their life would end in the wilderness. Many of them dying deaths of martyrdom at the hands of Indians they had gone to rescue. And Indians all over South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Indians all over suffered immensely at the hands of the Europeans. And the Indians, many of them were living terrible, ungodly lives. And God has to sort all that out. But when you brought the discovery of this nation, God, who did you use? And what did you do? And how did you establish it? And did it indicate what your intentions, your real intentions were for this country? Was it to be among those that in essence was raided and raped for gold and women? Is that what it was for? And self-promoting glory. One of them, Marcos de Niza, in 1539, so close to 100 years before the Pilgrims came, he was the first one into New Mexico. In 1630, it was written that he wrote that there were approximately 80,000, this is New Mexico, converts in 25 missions. I didn't know anything about that. They were all over the nation. Now, I don't mean there were literally thousands and thousands in every single state that we would call a state. California, the Baja Peninsula, up north, all the way up into Canada. There were so many of these heroic monks who, for the sake of the call of Christ as they understood it, they went about to proclaim Christ to those who were unreached in our nation, the Indians, and accomplished magnificent things, many of them dying martyrs' death. I appreciated the light and the glory, pictured them that they became convinced it was the blood of martyrs that was part of what God used to bring forth the life and the light of Christ throughout this nation that he intended. Just as the kingdom of God, the gospel of Jesus Christ, began with prophets, many prophets before who shed their blood for God's purposes. The center point is Christ and his shedding, his ultimately coming to reveal, to say, this is how it's done. You come for the Father's purpose. You come seeking his will. You come to do his will. That's what you do. And you come realizing you're going to pour your life out, whether it's every day bearing your cross, or whether it's a consuming moment of martyrdom for the purpose of Jesus Christ. Your ultimate purpose is not gain, your own personal gain. The ultimate purpose is not for your own glory. The ultimate purpose is you live for the purposes of God through Christ. And you're prepared to die, whether unto yourself or ultimately physically. It was the blood, a century and a half. If you look for the bloodlines, you have to look to the monks. The Franciscan friars were among them. The Dominican friars and the Jesuit priests. First one, 1700 in Arizona, to go to Arizona. And there was these little outposts of Christianity all over the United States. It was the beginning. It began with the monks seeking to win the lost. I never heard about that. I don't know where I was. The point being, there were impassioned men who were looking to abandon their life unto a far greater purpose than their life, knowing they were going to be a part of this huge new world that was being discovered. and the call of Christ and the purposes of Christ were prevailing. And for that, they gave themselves. It's interesting, it was the same spirit with the Pilgrims. The quality and the depth of commitment resulted in extensive martyrs of the monks for about a century and a half. It's fascinating reading. The founding of America. There were settlements. You could call those, they were missions. Some of them, I'm sure, rose to the size of a settlement. They were missions. So probably smaller than settlements. But I'm using a soft word. They were orphanages. They were learning, places of education. They were churches. Yes, settlements, areas could have sprouted up around them. But there were also settlements in the United States prior to what took place in 1620. In 1512, Ponce de Leon, he founded the first settlement, so to speak. He came to Florida seeking the fountain of youth. Florida was extremely hard to settle. I spent a lot of my life in Florida. The mosquitoes, the heat, the Indians in Florida were particularly virulent. The disease that they encountered in Florida. Florida was a very hard place to settle, at least according to the records. In 1562, the French Huguenots, another group, very religious-focused people, founded what's regarded as the first city in the United States, St. Augustine. Beautiful city. Beautiful history. It is not the beginning. There was so much that had taken place prior to that. That it was men, and again I say it, who were willing from the get-go to be planted, to die and be planted, themselves, for the purposes of Christ to be planted. And how they lived their life, how they wasted their life to the eyes of other people for the purposes of fulfilling Christ's mission and filling up his suffering. St. Augustine. The Jamestown in Virginia in 1607. There was the Indian chief Powhatan. His daughter was the famous Pocahontas. Yeah. I was told for years that the Porcella family in Grandpa Porcella, my dad's father, was an Italian, came from Italy. But his mother was partly Spanish, partly Indian, coming from, let's say, early American stock. We were told that Pocahontas was one of our relatives. We wore that badge proudly and would look for many opportunities to bring that one out. Yes, we are actually, I'm among the ultimate long-term descendants of Pocahontas. I understand now that Grandma, just before she died, said it's not true. It was all a hoax. The Porcella family doesn't have Pocahontas at its roots. If the story told of Pocahontas is true, she didn't marry Captain John Smith. I said, I didn't know that. How much I didn't know. She did marry another man and went to England when she was a young bride, 18, 19 years old. She unfortunately died in England, but her father was Chief Powhatan, and he was initially a real friend of the settlers until the settlers became unfriendly. This was in Jamestown, and war was set in motion between the Indians and the settlers, and there's the lost tribe, there's all those kinds of things. That's not what God had in mind. It didn't succeed. Then in 1620, there was a group of people that God had been working with who came, they were cut, I think a phrase that we use, they were cut from the same cloth as the monks. They fled England and went to Holland because they were seeking the freedom to be free from the Anglican Church. They spent about 12 years in Holland. And they came to the conclusion, one of their leaders, William Brewster, came to the conclusion that one, the work was so oppressively hard in Holland that they were aging prematurely. Number two, because they were aging prematurely, their desire to go to the New World, they would rapidly lose the ability to do so because they would no longer have the strength of youth. They were also getting more and more concerned about their young people who in Holland were being influenced by the values of Holland and the Holland youth of the day, and that they saw that they were in danger of or even losing the generation of their children. They came to realize if they were going to move after 12 years, if they were going to do this journey to the new world, they would have to do it, and they would have to do it quickly. It's a series of miracles that they came up with, the resources, the enabling, and the number of them that actually went in 1620 when they sailed. I told you last week when they came across, there's an attribute about them that wasn't crystal clear to me, but it revealed partly their heart. The people God used to found the country. My point is that Jesus made it clear that unless we're willing to be planted and die, no real fruit, lasting, kingdom-focused fruit, is going to take place. But if you are willing to live your life for another, for God's purposes for us, made possible in Jesus Christ, if you are willing to do that, and whether it's how you live your entire life, or how you live your life, or from when you made those decisions and said, I'm moving forward in this, I'm going to live for God. He's going to be my reason. He's not going to be what I look to at the end. Oh yeah, when we need to do this too. It's how I start. And it could be that for you, for them, for us, it is for many now in the world, it is their blood is shed. They're rewarded and honored for eternity in heaven. The book of Revelation speaks wonderfully about it. They did. They met this character named Squanto. And I just wanted to read this from Bradford. I wanted you to hear his wording from his journal. Squanto, you'll have to hear last week's message in order to gain more of appreciation if you don't know about Squanto. And he was to be, according to Bradford, his journal, this is how he describes Squanto in his journal. He was a special instrument sent of God for their good beyond their expectation. God used Squanto, an Indian, who almost 14, 15, 16 years before his life was altered totally from the path that he was on. He was taken to England aboard a ship and taken there to teach English, because there were many English seafaring, fishing captains who were marauding up and down the New England coast long before the Pilgrims. But their intentions was resources, gold, glory. Those were their intentions, not spreading the gospel. What the Pilgrims really wanted to do is they wanted to plant, they believed God wanted to use them to plant a new Israel, not to take the place of Israel in Palestine, a new Jerusalem, and to build a new temple unto God. The temple would be people that God would live in, as the scriptures teach, that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit of God Almighty. And their intentions were, they saw themselves, just as the Jews were released out of Egypt and brought into the land of promise that God had for them, they believed that they were a people of promise, that God had a land for them. They were not the first ones to that land, or the second, or the third, or the fourth, or the fifth, or so on. But they were different. Not really from the monks, who were one at a time, or went out in twos. But they believed God was going to establish a new land, a new Israel, meaning a country brought into being by God for his purposes, not the replacement of Israel of Palestine. A new Jerusalem, a place of worship, a new temple, that the people together, the corporate dwelling place for the Spirit of God. They would not have made it had not God prepared a special vehicle, just like he did Joseph for the nation of Israel, the Hebrews. We covered that last time. What he taught them, the first thing he taught them when he came into their lives, just picking up the story, was how to fish for eels and brought back. The next thing he taught them was how to plant corn. So this is early in the spring. That's when March of 1621. That's when Squanto came into their place. He taught them how to plant corn Indian style. That was put a corn kernel and put several fish, because that would be the fertilizer. And he taught them, after you plant, you've got to watch for 2 weeks because of wolves. They will come and try and dig up all the fish. That's very understandable. Or raccoons or whatever have you. He taught them how to plant. Cod. They had only caught one fish in 4 months of fishing, and he taught them that, he said actually for 4 days from the time that he came to them, he said the cod will be running just like the salmon run. So he taught them how to make baskets and said we're going to go, in essence, harvest cod, which they did, is where they got all the fish. They harvested them in these weir baskets. They were taught. He taught them how to stalk deer. He taught them how to plant pumpkins. He taught them how to get maple sap out of the trees. He taught them that the real crop that will be of money for you because of all the traders. There were many traders that were coming up and down. Some of them more kind-hearted than not. Some of them very unkind-hearted, not a very good way to say that, but very self-centered, very gold-centered. Their profit, their gain at whatever the cost. That's how Squanto made a second trip away from the United States. Wasn't the United States, obviously, then. He was captured just after he came back, being gone 7-8 years, by a slave trader and taken to Spain and purchased by a group of monks, and made his way back to that area fairly quickly. But he taught them the value, the worth of the beaver pelt. And what were they thankful for? What were they thankful for? What were things to them that they attributed, this has come from God? This year, all I heard was turkey. So you would come away with what do the Americans have to look back on as, why are we celebrating this day anyhow? It's Turkey Day. Well, if we go back to the first day, October of 1621, what is it that the pilgrims, those who survived, 47 of them died the first winter, almost half of the 102, they died of pneumonia, they died of consumption, they died of hunger, they couldn't make it in the New World, meaning physically. Many of the men, a good number of the wives. Interestingly, most of the children made it. But they buried 47. What were they thankful for? When they left England, the record is in Northampton, when they were ready to get on originally the Speedwell and the Mayflower. The Speedwell never made it across. They made several attempts to go out into the Atlantic and came back because the Speedwell was leaking and became one boat. They now all knelt down on the shore and they thank God for his provision, his calling, and how he provided for them. And they were taking off, but they were doing so with their heart, worshiping God, exalting him. I didn't include that. When they got and made it across 7 weeks, it was interesting that they saw God's provision, God's hand. And among the crew of the Mayflower, there was one who was willing to go ashore with the first and second landing parties as they were trying to find a place. Where would they build their new settlement? And he had been there before, and he knew where to go. But as they were on their way, Bradford's record is that a violent snowstorm came up and they lost their way and they ended up in a harbor area that was not their intention. But the snowstorm and all the ravages of a violent sea, they ended up, not on the Mayflower at this point in time, they were in the schooner that they had brought so they could do navigation. They came into an area that he was unfamiliar with. And it happened to be when they got on shore, the first thing they did when they arrived, the Documents Journal says they got down on their knees and they thanked God. I know many of the conquistadors and those, they planted a cross and they would kneel down. But that was not what their heart was wrapped with, it was not the ground that they were actually standing on was, I have come that my life may be a seed that's put in the ground and dies unto its own purposes. And the purposes of Christ will be the fruit that come from it. That's not what was in their hearts. There were a few that were among them, the monks that they brought, that was in their hearts. And I've mentioned that briefly. They came to a place where it had already been, the ground had already been, the forest, at least 4 years before, had already been taken out. There were 20 acres of plantable land. There were huts that were destroyed. There were bones of a lot of people. They eventually found out that that was the Pautext village. And there was one survivor of the Pautext nation, I'll say. And that was Squanto. And he, for nearly 16 years, spent his life over in Europe, learning English, learning the English ways, not because he volunteered and paid his fare, because as Joseph was of old, he was violently taken. So Squanto was violently taken, especially the second time, intended for slave trade. The Pautext landing, it was the perfect place. 50 miles away, dropping down two names at Massawat, he was a king, and the village that he ruled over was about 50 miles away. He was highly respected. He actually ruled over several villages. He was very benevolent, and on the first meeting I said he was willing to establish a peace treaty with the Pilgrims that lasted 40 years. It was so different from any of the other, not the monks, but any of the other settlements that had been established. They knew nothing like that. There were other Indians that were enemies, but Massawat and his braves and those that he had rule over, Samoset and Squanto, the 40-year peace treaty, they were thankful for Samoset, the first Indian that came into their group. They were thankful for Squanto. Squanto and Samoset were together. They were in Massawat's village. They were thankful for Massawat and all his braves. They were thankful for the 40 years of peace that they had with that king of that area. And they were thankful for timing, the timing of God, the timing of a snowstorm, that they ended up in a place that wasn't their intention. The timing of when it was time to plant the crops, they made it through the winter, about half of them, a little more than half. It was time to plant crops. They didn't have a clue what to do. And into their camp walks this Indian, nearly naked, and says to them in pretty flawless English, "Welcome, and do you have any beer?" And he leads them to Squanto. And Squanto stays with them and teaches them all of these things. The timing. That march, it could have been, if it was a march a year away from them, they doubt that they would have survived because they just didn't have the food. They didn't have the knowledge. Timing of everything. Of Squanto and the timing of God. They were so thankful for all of those things. So, the first Thanksgiving, their governor was Governor Bradford. He declared a day of public thanksgiving in October for all of those things. That they recognize, God, you are the one that really made all this happen. We can say that about this land that we're on as a congregation. Maybe only half of you really know the story that are in the room right now. We existed for 4 years. We were a storefront church. I believed because of, in my own life, if God calls something into being, he has land for you. And we got to the place where we had to move out of where we were. We were on Clinton Highway in a storefront building, and we had used up all available space to us. And we discovered this property, it was not for sale. We discovered it, and we found the owner and explained, we'd like to buy it. It's not for sale. Well, we'd like to buy it. How much land is there? And these things taught us, well, he said there's 7.7 acres, and I want $77,000 for it. And we said, we won't borrow money, just why we're not borrowing money to buy this property. But for the purposes, the purposes of the global harvest and what will be taking place here, we desperately need that land. For today, no, we don't need that land for today. For the purposes, yes, we have to prepare today for what is coming. But we needed land. But it was in my heart, not going to borrow money. If God's called us into being, he'll provide land. And he'll provide money. And if he doesn't provide the money, we don't want the land. We will not borrow. Not everybody was willing to come into agreement. It's not what everybody would have chosen, but they were willing to come into agreement. We actually found out the front acre is under a 100-year flood zone, so he took $7,000 off the price. So make it $70,000. He gave us 6 months to raise the money. We actually had to raise $77,777.78 because we gave a tithe off of all the money that was raised. So we could give a tithe and pay him $70,000. With a few weeks to go, through many miracles, we came up with $70,000 and we bought the land. And about a week or two later, Vicki, who was our bookkeeper in one of the early computers, came to me in the office, which was in a different building on Clinton Highway. She said, Russ, do you know how many people contributed to this $77,700? I said, Vicki, I don't have a clue. That was your job. She said, there were 77 different entities, units, families, people, individuals, different who gave. I know there weren't. You're trying to tell me we bought 7.7 acres of land that originally was sold for $77,000 and there were 77 units, individual giving units? I said, go count it again. She said, I did it on a computer, Russ. The computer counted. It could be wrong, but probably not. That was my introduction that God, among the many languages of God, is the language of numbers. And I became convinced that's the handprint of God. And our journey began the same way. God, you've picked this property. That's how the pilgrims felt. You picked this place. Where that plague came from and that tribe was wiped out, and nobody else would come there because they were afraid of that plague. So that land that another tribe could have come and gotten, it was not Turkey Day. They were thankful for the hand of God. But I believe God was thankful for their hearts. So they invited Squanto, Samoset, and Massasoit to this day of Thanksgiving. What they didn't expect is that Massasoit, this king, and 90 of his braves would show up one day early. Now that really taxes you about how thankful and giving am I going to be? There were 90 more people that came to dinner than you expected. They had an abundance of supplies for winter for them. But for 90 people, for a big feast that lasted, they had so much fun, it lasted 3 days. But they showed up with 5 dressed deer and 12, Bradford wrote, fat turkeys. I guess that's where Turkey Day comes from. They played games. They had shooting contests with rifles and bow and arrow. They did foot races. They had leg racing. And an extended 3 days. That was the first Thanksgiving. I believe God was thankful for a whole group of people that had a unified heart. We exist for the purposes and the will of God. Not as the last on a list, but as the number one. We exist for this reason. I think God was thankful for them. They were certainly thankful for an abundance of things that they attributed. We wouldn't have made it without this. So, the location. What were they thankful for? What can you be thankful for as you look at your life? And you're looking, do I see the hand of God in my life? Do I see his provision? The location. Do I see his provision in the location? I, as a pastor, do of this land. Does that mean we're better or more than anybody? Oh, no. Oh, no. Everybody's story is their own story. Only speaking of our story. I believe God chose this land because he had intentions of what would take place on this property. The authority. What authority was it under? That property, that area was under the authority of that king who was willing, Massasoit, who was willing to make a 40-year peace treaty that held. The authority that they were under. The authority of God. The people they needed that they didn't even know they needed. They were thankful for the people. That king. Samoset, and above all, Squanto. That God had prepared specially for them, and they recognized it. And it reinforced their belief that God's called us here to establish a new Israel, another one. Not a replacement, but a new Israel, a new Jerusalem, a place for God, a new temple, people, with God living in them. That was their intention. Not the pursuit of gold, not the pursuit of glory, not the pursuit of women. The people they needed, the God-centeredness it held. When the day came, when the Mayflower captain chose to stay the winter, when the day came for him, he had to go back to England. He offered them, he would give them a ride back to England. He stayed longer than he intended to. He was so favorably impressed, at least according to Bradford's journals, with the Pilgrims and their spirit and their heart. He was so favorably impressed. He offered them, I'll give you a ride back to England. Not one of them took it. Was it because they had such a delightful time? No, they were as seeds planted that had to die. They buried half their number. They were as seeds that had to die. But in doing so, because they were in, so to speak, God's garden. If you remove God out of the picture, you have nothing but biology. But they were seeds in God's garden. And he was the one who was bringing forth fruit. And in the founding of America, it seems what he used was in many individual locations, Spanish monks, a few English monks, some Italian, some Portuguese, mostly Spanish, people who were willing to be planted every day. And a fair number of them at a point in time. And their blood became part of the blood, the sacrifice, the price for the land to be dedicated to God's purposes. The redemptive, clearing blood. The God-centeredness, they were thankful for that. I'm going to stop there. Powerful Thanksgiving passages. I want to continue next week focusing on Thanksgiving, looking at it in the New Testament, and then looking at it in the life of Jesus in the Gospels. What did he have to do and to say, and how did he act on, and when was thanks and thanksgiving a part of what he had to say or speak to? Leaving the Pilgrims and the United States behind. That's the real reason for Thanksgiving. A people who, in every dimension, they saw, God, you did this. God, you did this. God, you made this possible. And establish a day of thanksgiving. Though many in our nation may have veered far from that, you don't have to. You don't have to. I believe we've all been called to be seeds planted in God's garden. That we're not living under our agenda and our intention. We are living under God's agenda, God's destiny, His that he has made for us. And we may or may not experience a martyr's death. As I've said on various occasions, if it comes to the point in time in history when they want you to take the mark of the beast or be beheaded, my recommendation is be beheaded. But that's another story. That's another day. I was so taken back. I knew so little of our history. And God, how you did it, how you moved on the hearts of the pilgrims, how you moved on the hearts of so many monks to pour out their life for this new country. It's what God did. They had to humble themselves to God's purposes.